race is more targeted to policing than others?
Say again?
Like finding a specific race more targeted to police than others?
So what would be an example of a sample that would directly accomplish that?
Does it African Americans or Hispanics?
Trying to see how racial attitudes are, how they affect police officers or police departments. So just going into an African American neighborhood and studying the people there, right? One example I thought of was studying why people complain about the police and then going to people who filed complaints against Hays PD this year, okay? Now, that's not saying that's not like, Enrique, your idea is a valid way to study things, but we have to understand that there may be differences within that sample that are not present throughout the population. First off, if we just go with people who have complained about the police and ask them what their views of the police are, we're looking at people who felt strongly enough to actually go to a website or go to a police department and file a complaint. Right? Same with things like quota sampling. This is similar to the stratified random sampling, but it is when we're assuming that those differences are there. Okay. So I made, I guess, the assumption that Fort Hays is, let's say, 60% female, 40% male. Quota sampling would say, we're just going to do 50-50. So we have 500 slots in our sample. The first 250 females who come through the door get selected for the sample. The first 250 males coming through the door get selected for the sample. Everyone else gone, all right? Basically what that leads to is, first off, the gender balance is off because we've artificially imposed this quota. And second, we basically said, we're just taking people up to a point. We're taking people based on these characteristics. Okay? Making sense? Snowball sampling is one of the more interesting non-probabilistic sampling techniques because it is the only technique that really allows researchers to study really rare phenomena. Okay. So an example of this would be something like gang members, or one of my favorite examples would be like armed robbers. Okay. There is a really interesting book called Armed Robbers in Action. Basically, it was a series of interviews that these two researchers, Wright and Decker, conducted with people who had either been arrested for armed robbery or were identified as armed robbers by the other people. And the reason why that was so important and kind of really cool is because they asked these guys, why do you do this? How do you select your targets? Why do you do this versus other types of crime? Like, it would be a really, really, really hard study to do with a random sample. You'd basically be like mailing things out to people in the hope that they are a robber and that they would be willing to answer an anonymous survey, rather than like you identifying people within the social network and then asking them to tell you about other people. Okay. So it's a great technique for studying those rare groups, but also introduces a lot of bias because first and foremost, you're relying on those first people's social networks to tell you what's going on. Maybe you just have contacts within one part of the social network and there's another separate group of people who are doing this behavior or exhibit these characteristics. Making sense? Okay. So the reason we care about this is because when researchers decide how they're going to study or how they're going to collect their sample, it's going to lead to issues that will influence what types of results they can get. So for instance, most drug trials start out as animal trials, all right? They test the drug on animals to make sure that it's not going to just immediately kill them, and it also has some kind of effect. But what tended to happen was that they would exclude female animals from these studies, okay? Because the researchers were trying to get an accurate baseline, and females go through hormone fluctuations, okay? As a consequence of that, for decades, we didn't know how these drugs would affect women until we gave it to human women, which is why there are a lot of drugs that are gender specific, and why for decades we didn't know it wasn't popular knowledge about how females experience heart attacks. For males, it's really sharp pain on the left side, numbness, tingling down the left arm, left side of the face. That's atypical for females. Females, they get more of a crushing sense of impending doom. Literally, that is the symptom of a heart attack for females. But we didn't know that because most of our research was conducted on males. I have a short video concerning issues within psychology, but basically it comes down to the idea that psychology as a field has issues with collecting samples. All right. Tevin, can you see the YouTube video?
I can, yes.
Yeah.
In 1998, a scientist named Roy Baumeister decided to investigate a question that psychologists had been thinking about for a while. Do people have a limited amount of willpower? To figure it out, he and his research group did what researchers do. They conducted a study. The results of that study seem to show that humans do have a limited pool of self-control. In other words, once we've had to resist temptation, it's a lot harder to do it again. They call this effect ego depletion, and the idea has had a huge influence on psychological research ever since. It's been incorporated into things like dieting tactics, athletic training techniques, and advertising. But now, it seems like the phenomenon might not exist at all, which has a lot of scientists worried about the way we do psychology research in general. The concept of the ego goes way back. Sigmund Freud, who's often called the father of modern psychology, described the ego as the aspect of our personality that makes decisions about how to interact with the real world. The ego has to figure out how to balance our needs and desires within the context of reality and society. Freud believed that the ego would need energy to keep up with those demands and decisions. That was about as far as he got. Baumeister and his colleagues were trying to test the 1990s version of this idea, that self-control is a limited resource, and it takes energy and motivation to maintain restraint. According to this ego depletion theory, every time you use your self-control, you draw on that strength, and it takes some time for you to recover. So to test this hypothesis, Baumeister's team decided to create a task that would require 2 acts of self-control back to back. They figured if self-control can be used up, then having to use a lot of self-control on the first task would mean that the subjects would have less self-control available for the second task. So first they baked a bunch of chocolate chip cookies in a little oven in the lab, so the whole room smelled like fresh cookies. Then they invited 67 psych students into the lab, making sure they hadn't eaten anything for a while. When the students arrived, they were each brought into the baking room and asked to sit at a table. On the table were 2 plates, one filled with those fresh, delicious cookies, and the other filled with radishes. Some of the students were told that they had to eat the radishes, but no cookies, while others were told that they were supposed to eat the cookies, but no radishes. Then each student was left alone in the room for 5 minutes. When the experimenter came back, they asked the students to try to solve a difficult puzzle. But here's the thing. The puzzle was designed to be impossible to solve. What the researchers really wanted to know was how long it took for the students to give up, and if spending a few minutes resisting cookies would make it harder for them to keep trying. They found a big difference between the students who weren't allowed to eat cookies and the students who were. The students who were asked to only eat radishes before doing the puzzle gave up on it in about 8 minutes. But the students who were told to eat the cookies worked at the puzzle for more than twice as long, almost 19 minutes on average. When a third group of students did the puzzle without any cookie encounters at all, they spent just a little longer trying to solve it, averaging 21 minutes each. This seemed like very solid evidence for ego depletion. The researchers concluded that the students who were only allowed to eat radishes had to use a lot of self-control not to touch the delicious chocolatey cookies, so when they got to the puzzle test, they didn't have much willpower left to spare. But the students who got to eat the cookies didn't have to control themselves. They could just dig right in. Their willpower reserves were much higher, so they worked at the puzzle longer. The same group did several more experiments designed to test willpower under different circumstances and found the same results. Whenever participants were asked to do something that required self-control, they had a harder time with the puzzle task, which was a huge deal. A lot of the time, it can be difficult to draw broad conclusions from psychology studies. Often effects are only seen under very specific conditions, and if you change an experiment even a little, you might end up with very different findings. But Baumeister and his colleagues have shown that this effect applied to more than just cookies and radishes. Ego depletion showed up in all kinds of different experiments. And after that, ego depletion basically became its own subfield of psychology. In 2007, researchers at Florida State University figured out what seemed to be happening biologically as people used up their self-control. Their blood sugar levels were dropping. Our brains are high energy oriented. They need a lot of energy to keep going, and that energy comes from sugar. The team thought that the psychological effort of maintaining self-control might use up extra energy, which could mean that the brain was burning through its available reserves faster than normal. They tested this idea by having some subjects do willpower-related tasks, like watching an emotional or graphic video without showing any emotion, while other subjects didn't have to hold back. Sure enough, the people who used some willpower had lower blood glucose levels. And when they replenished that glucose with a nice refreshing glass of sugary lemonade, it seemed to restore their self-control. The evidence was pretty convincing. It became even more convincing in 2010 when yet another group of researchers did a meta-analysis. They examined the results from 83 different published studies on ego depletion, and concluded that the effect was real. But recently, some studies have started to cast doubt on this whole ego depletion thing. One group of researchers, for example, found that subjects didn't actually have to drink lemonade to replenish their willpower. Just tasting it without the corresponding changes in blood glucose could be enough. Others found that what subjects believed about willpower could affect their performance on self-control tasks. Participants who believed ego depletion was real gave up on difficult tasks way before those who didn't. And people who thought of willpower as an infinite resource did just as well on the second difficult task as people who hadn't done the first task at all. Then in 2014, some scientists tried to replicate the original studies and couldn't find the effect. The group decided to look more closely at that 2010 meta-analysis, and they found a whole bunch of problems. For one thing, when they reanalyzed the data using newer methods, the ego depletion effect disappeared. For another, the data included in the analysis in the first place was probably biased in favor of ego depletion. See, scientific publications tend to publish positive results, the kind that prove the researcher's hypothesis. In other words, researchers might have done lots of studies that didn't find evidence of ego depletion, but odds are those results wouldn't have gotten published. The meta-analysis only looked at the data from published studies. There might have been plenty of studies that didn't find the ego depletion effect, but the analysis just wasn't taking those into account. When the team went back and included other unpublished data in the analysis, they found that, again, the ego depletion effect just wasn't there. These results were popping up right as a wave of concern about replicability was spreading through the psychology community. More and more researchers were saying they couldn't reproduce the results of various psychological studies. This wasn't just ego depletion, this was all of psychology. People were starting to doubt whether they could really trust the published literature. All of this uncertainty led the Association for Psychological Science to open a registered replication report on ego depletion. Basically, one official experiment based on a study originally published in 2014 would be conducted by researchers in many different labs. Each group of scientists would analyze the results and compare them to the results of other research groups. Baumeister, the head of the original study, was brought in to help design the experiment, and the psychologist who led the 2010 meta-analysis, Martin Hager, agreed to lead the project. Subjects were told to watch words flash on a screen and press a button whenever they saw a word containing the letter E, but not if the letter E was within 2 spaces of another vowel. That sounds like the most tedious, annoying thing ever. That was the point. The subjects had to pay close attention. Just like the original study, they then had to perform a follow-up self-control task. But when Hager's team did the same experiment in 24 different labs in different countries and languages, the ego depletion effect evaporated. Only 2 of the 24 groups found the effect at all, and even one group found the opposite effect. So what does this all mean for ego depletion? It depends. You could argue that it's just this particular task with the words flashing on the screen where ego depletion doesn't show up, but the willpower is still a limited resource. The thing is, the main reason why the ego depletion effect was such a big deal was that it held true across so many different tests, from cookies and radishes to conversations about race and discrimination to making decisions about what cleaning product to buy. But now it seems like ego depletion only happens under very specific circumstances, if at all. Baumeister has said that he plans to launch his own replication studies in the hopes of proving that the effect is real. And other scientists who participated in the registered replication report have said that this single failed replication isn't enough. More research needs to be done with different experimental methods before psychologists can come to any real conclusions. In the meantime, some researchers have described the field as being back at square one. Ego depletion might be real, but it's going to take a lot more work and a lot more replication to know for sure. Either way, this whole thing is serving as a kind of cautionary tale when it comes to scientific research, especially in social psychology. Often sample sizes are small and the subjects are mainly university students, so results of studies don't necessarily apply to the whole population. It's also very difficult, if not impossible, to reproduce the results of earlier research in other labs with different researchers and subjects. For scientists who are just looking for the truth, it's a problem. Lots of people are talking about ways to improve the situation. One thing that might...
Okay. So when we're talking about psychological research and even criminal justice research, we have to understand where our sample is coming from, right? Research conducted here in Hayes may not mean anything for agencies that don't look like Hayes, or cities that don't look like Hayes. There aren't that many rural college towns in the Midwest. Like the only ones I'm thinking of right now are places like Emporia. And where's Pitt State at? Is it? I don't know. But again, it's just like when we're doing research on something, we have to understand that all research is conducted in a unique setting, okay? And the big issue with psychology was that they were making a pretty foundational assumption that people are the same no matter where they're at, okay? That's their big assumption in psychology, that the environment plays little to no role in that, which is why that video alluded to the idea of the replication crisis and the other issues within psychology, because most psychological research is conducted at universities, which means they're using university students as their sample. Like the original study in ego depletion that the video just mentioned had 63 students, university students from the 90s. So those 63 students were effectively standing in for everyone, right? And the issue with that comes with the idea that college students are different from people who are not college students. Like, even though I've been to college, I'm different than you guys. Different reaction times, different understanding, different willpower levels, if you want to go that far. But there are differences, okay? So how the researcher goes about gathering this sample is going to make a big difference as to whether or not that the results from that sample mean anything, okay? Making sense? All right. So when we're trying to figure out what a sample should look like, we have two things we have to balance, all right? In addition to just looking at the characteristics of our sample, we have to figure out how many is enough for our research. How many cases or people or groups or states or jurisdictions should we include in this? Because we need to understand that research methods overall relies on statistics, okay? And depending on how you do statistics, your sample size is a very big part of that. And it comes in the idea of what's called statistical power, all right? This is basically a calculation that researchers do to figure out how big their study needs to be to determine if there's an actual effect, all right? The calculation's a pain in the ass. Again, I'm never gonna teach you guys math, but I am gonna talk about it, all right? But the power calculation basically says that you need a sample size this big to determine whether or not you're going to find anything, all right? But conversely, you can't have a sample that's so big or too big, all right? Having a sample of 100,000 people sounds great, but also our results in statistics include the sample size. So the bigger the sample size, the more likely you are to find an effect. All right. So this is where it comes in to try to balance what we're doing, what we're trying to figure out. All right. Making sense? Kevin, everything making sense?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. So we're trying to figure out what our answer is. We're trying to incorporate things like experimental design and measures and all this other things. For internal and external validity, the best thing we have, the most accurate method in which we can determine if we actually have an effect is through a random or a true experiment with a randomly selected sample that is representative of the population of interest. But as we talked about 2 weeks ago, RCTs are extremely difficult to do in criminal justice and with basically any other social science. This is why Eck basically argued that we should be focusing more on collecting a lot of small samples, doing pre-experimental designs, and then trying to account for that with things like meta-analyses and systematic reviews. But then the issue comes down with, well, if we're doing crappy designs, we're going to get crappy results. All right. If we just basically test anything that we can think of in a very rudimentary way, we're not going to get very far. Okay. Making sense?
Yes.
Okay. That's kind of all I had for you guys today, unless you wanted to go into additional things.
I'm good. I'm good with whatever.
I mean, there are only 2 of you in class right now, so I don't want to keep you if you are done talking about methods right now. It's always harder to like keep someone or keep people for like the full hour and 15 minutes when there are 2 people versus 6. All right. Well, I can give you guys kind of an example of what we're talking about here. So, come on. Giving you guys basically a preview of what you guys are hopefully going to be taking in a couple weeks. So each of these areas represents a different group of questions that those of us in the department think are like really important for people to like tell the administration about, all right? So when we're talking about sampling and everything, we have to understand that any data we get from this is only going to reflect the people who decide to turn in the survey. Okay. So it's called a responsivity bias, I believe, response bias. So ideally speaking, for a survey like this, we want about 20% of the student population to turn it in, because that way we have enough people that we could say, okay, we have enough here that we can do something with it. Bad thing is, by only shooting for like 20% of people to participate, we have to make some pretty big assumptions about that. We have to assume basically that the people who participate are the same as the people who are choosing not to. How many of you guys check your email daily?
I do.
You both do? Well, how many of you know people, or do you guys know anyone who doesn't check their email at all? So the survey would be going to you guys, but the people who don't check their email very often might miss it. Or like some people probably don't want to talk about any victimization experiences or their experiences with sexual violence or stalking or sexual harassment or anything like that. They may just not want to talk about it. They may think that, oh, I don't have anything to say because this has never happened to me. So we would basically be overcounting sexual harassment or sex-related victimization because people who don't or haven't experienced that would be less likely to participate. So in a couple of weeks, when we start talking about survey design, this is something we're gonna have to think about. Like this group of questions with police legitimacy, like this is going to be a pretty difficult topic for a lot of people because there are some pretty strong attitudes about the police right now. So our results are likely to be affected because there have been so many historical or like current event problems with policing right now. Making sense? This is the only other thing I had for you guys. So unless you guys got anything, I'm kind of out of. All right. Well, I will see you guys on Tuesday or Monday, I guess, since both of you guys are in my other classes. So.
Alrighty. Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.